Hello, Dom. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Miriam.
I
Excited to be
am,
here.
yeah, and I'm so excited. I've been to your show already talking about the role of facilitation in group coaching. And now we turn it around to talk about the role of facilitation in group coaching, but more from the group coaching perspective. So I'm very pleased to have you here with us today. And to kick it off, do you call yourself a facilitator? And if yes, since when?
I used to call myself a facilitator, and I do in certain contexts. Um, it started, so my background is educational leadership, so worked in education for many, many years. And I remember a training, it was one of my first leadership trainings, the very early in my education career. And someone said, as teachers, we're facilitators of learning. And that stuck with me because and this person, this trainer was saying, we're not here to tell students what to learn. We're not there to tell them. We're here to facilitate their growth. We're here to help them understand, to ask questions, to, decompose concepts, deconstruct. And that really stuck with me. And that's something that and from then I started calling myself a facilitator of learning.
Yeah.
And that stayed with me for many, many years. I led many workshops for the IB, the International Baccalaureate, facilitating training for teachers. And now I facilitate training for coaches. And so I do call myself a facilitator in those moments. I don't call myself a facilitator when I'm in coaching mode. And then I'm a coach. So that's the big difference for me.
And I love that. And I would be curious to hear more about this mental switch that you put in when you put yourself into coaching mode. What changes in your stance, in your presence, in your behavior, maybe even mental being?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think when I'm in facilitation mode, I feel much more, or I want to be much more in control in a way of what's going on. Not in control in terms of I need to be at the center of everything, but I feel that I am always keeping an eye on everything, on everyone, ensuring that everybody is on task, everybody is engaged. I think when I'm in coaching mode, I am paying much more attention to the flow and the flow of conversation. I am paying more attention to the content of what's being said, to ensuring that my group coaching participants are themselves staying in coach mode and asking each other questions versus telling each other what to do or giving advice. So I think the it's a very slight difference now that I'm thinking about it, but I think that in my own being, when I'm a facilitator, I'm much more present than when I'm a group coach. I think when I'm a group coach, I tend to take a step back and be more observant of what's happening for the group.
Very interesting. Thank you. And
Yeah.
I love this distinction of paying attention to the engagement. And it sounds as if you're kind of giving up responsibility. And I wonder whether participants who sign up for group coaching might be more intrinsically motivated in the first stage than those who are in charge of or who are participants of a facilitated workshop.
I think there's a huge difference in the way people show up, because there's a huge difference that to me is really important in the pre-coaching education piece, if you like. So most people know how to show up at a workshop, right? I mean, hopefully then they are challenged to not just show up and wait for things to happen, hopefully. But I think most people know how to show up at a workshop. They arrive, they know they're going to be engaged. With coaching, my expectation for my groups is that everybody becomes a coach to each other. And in order for that to happen, they need to understand what that means. And so before the group even begins, before the coaching engagement begins, I usually have either one-on-one conversations with each participant, or sometimes a mini orientation where I have everyone when we talk about what coaching is, what coaching isn't, how you show up as a coach, how that means asking each other questions, not giving each other advice, that sort of thing. And so I think that they know, I let them know that the experience is theirs to create. I don't have an agenda, which I do have when I'm facilitating a workshop. I know that I need to get through this content, and we're going to move things forward in this way. With coaching, the group that shows up brings the agenda. So what's happening for everyone in this moment, and what do we want to be thinking about? So there's definitely a difference there.
And if I understand correctly, then there is no precise, tangible outcome or goal that the group has to co-create, as in a workshop. So
Exactly.
Everyone has to be responsible of their own journey, because if they are not working, if they are not contributing, they personally don't get anything out. Whereas in a workshop, okay, if we don't achieve a decision or we don't come up with ideas, whatever. But if in a coaching situation, if I don't get to the next stage, to this breakthrough that I need, it's my responsibility.
Exactly. And here I want to make a very important distinction, which is team coaching versus group coaching.
Ooh, thank you.
Because in a team coaching environment, there probably is much more of an agenda, much more of a common goal that we're working towards. With group coaching, we have a group of participants who are not dependent on each other to achieve the goals that they've set out to achieve. And so they'll come into the group, and we might have a topic that we've agreed on before. So let's say we're talking about communication, right? And how to be more confident communicators. And so for each of them at the beginning of the session, I'll ask them to think about, well, what would you like to get from this conversation? And it's really their role to ask questions of other participants and think that through so that they get what they want to get out of this conversation, because we now have 6, 7, 8 people who all want something slightly different from it. So it's so you're right. It's a very different entry into the group than a workshop might be, or than a team coaching engagement might be.
And then what would be a context in which a group coaching happens? And I'm asking because because I'm generally curious, and I think that there's a big gap in understanding or misunderstanding where the difference is between a group that is facilitated and group coaching. So how does this group come together about what kind of purposes? Maybe you can give some examples.
Definitely. So two potential areas, right? The personal and the professional. So if we think about the personal first, usually a group coaching program will last for a few months, right? So it's not a one-off. Workshops could be just a one-off. You come in, there might be a follow-up, maybe 2 consecutive workshops, but with group coaching, we're usually looking at months of engagement. And in the personal realm, that could be anything from a group of people going through a similar life transition. So everybody is going through, or everybody has just had a child, right? And so that could be one. One of my great coach friends is putting on together a coaching group for expats who have just moved to the United States. So it could be anything like that. It could be around body image. So in the personal realm, those are examples that we can have. In the professional context, often groups are around leadership. And so it might be a coaching group around emerging leaders. Everybody has just recently been promoted to being a leader in an organization. They all work sometimes in completely different organizations, but they come together, sometimes in different departments of the organization. So you might have, someone who's a new leader in operations, and someone who's a new leader in sales, and someone who's a new leader in marketing, and they get together to think about what it means to be a new leader, regardless of their context. So the second piece that I want to address is, you're right. Often we think of group coaching as facilitated workshops. With group coaching, I'm a little bit of a purist. We often have hybrid programs. And so it could be a program where there is some content that is facilitated, and then there's a group coaching element. And so the coaching element is that piece of the conversation, the asking each other questions, coaching each other, that is named and that is looked at differently from the facilitated piece.
So it would be, if I understand correctly, there's a piece where it's bridging a knowledge gap, like a training.
Exactly.
Where everyone learns what is important, what does leadership mean, what are the skills of a leader, the mindset of a leader. And then the group coaching part would be, okay, now given this context and we are all on the same level, what does it mean to apply it, to reflect on it? Yeah.
Exactly. And what we would do is make it concrete to the person, to their situation of the moment. So let's go a little deeper even. Let's say that this keep going with the effective communication example. Let's say that being a leader, part of that is being an effective communicator. So we might look at one session is content delivery around this is what it looks like to be an effective communicator. And then the next session may be, okay, think of a situation right now in your leadership where you're finding obstacles to applying the tools we talked about last time. Perhaps there's a difficult conversation that you've had to have, and let's coach around that. What was difficult around it? What did you notice about yourself in that moment when you're having that conversation? So now we're going deeper into the being and the doing and the action, and what the obstacles might be to applying the content that we reviewed.
And previously you just said that in a group coaching context, everyone becomes a coach. So you can remove yourself a little bit more, and it's more of, I guess, space holding the container for the group. Is this something that applies to group coaching in general, or is this your way of doing group coaching?
I think this is how we teach group coaching for sure. In my organization, I would hope that it is the way that most people approach group coaching. I know it isn't. And often, I see a lot of group coaching sessions where basically it's the coach coaching one person in front of other people, and everybody gets 10 minutes of coaching, and that's that. I think that's a little sad. I think it's a big missed opportunity to allow others to learn the skills of coaching, to learn how to listen deeply, because if they know that, hey, you're going to have to ask each other questions, then immediately the people listen in a very different way. They pay attention to what's being said. But if they're like, oh, well, the coach is going to coach this person, they could be on their phone, if they really wanted to. Yeah. So I'm not saying there's only one way to do group coaching, because there isn't. And certainly there are a lot of different ways to structure a session. But to me, part of being in a group coaching situation is that the group is coaching. That's the idea.
I
Yeah.
love that. And I can see that there are different ways, and that some group coaches would then rather have the individual coach coaching in front of a group audience almost.
Exactly.
And I can also see how this reduces complexity for the coach.
So
And creates also a different sort of dependence, is maybe a big of a word.
you're so spot on. I think that's the thing. It's like, so sometimes I think it's a little bit ego driven, this idea of like, I'm at the center of everything, I'm the coach. And there's sometimes a lack of trust that each participant in the group can ask powerful questions. And that's one of the things that we talk about in our trainings, is that, as the group gets to know each other better, as they get deeper connections between each other, they get more comfortable asking each other questions, challenging each other. And sometimes the role as a coach, this has happened to me. I'll be like, I don't need to be here. They're great. They're doing their thing. They're asking questions. They're having deep conversations, and maybe there's like 10 minutes where I'm not, 15 minutes where I'm not intervening at all. I'm just observing So what I say in those moments is that I still have a role here. My role is to ensure that I'm noticing, the overarching themes that are showing up, so that I can mirror that back to the group afterwards. My role is to continue to ensure that everybody is engaged. Perhaps there's a lot of great conversations, but only 4 out of 7 people are having that conversation. So my role is to make sure that everybody is brought back in. Another thing that is really important for me as a group coach is that I am able to help them deepen their questions and continue to challenge each other, because as a group gets more comfortable, sometimes we see less challenge start to happen, because they're like, oh yeah, you're right, and they're being nice to each other. But how can I make sure that everybody is sharing different perspectives? So I think the word dependence is actually a really important one, because with coaching, the idea is that everybody has agency over the experience, right? And I have mixed feelings about, being only in coach mode all the time. I don't think that's always serving people well. I think sometimes we need to step into different types of roles. But this idea of creating agency and letting the group co-create the space, co-create the safety, co-create the environment, is really important. And so for me as a group coach, I know that I tend to step back quite a bit and let them know, hey, this is your experience to create. You have agency over what's going on. If you feel that the conversation is not going in a direction that's useful for you, then what are you going to do to change it?
And I find it so fascinating to just decompose the difference between group coaching and facilitation. Because what I also hear, and I have a lot of follow-up questions, but what I hear is that while the role of a facilitator, or the big chunk of work, is actually in the preparation, in designing a process, thinking of different activities, how I imagine now the process of a group coach is rather maybe preparing the participants to be in the mindset and maybe having the skill set, but then in the moment is rather to step back and asking prompting questions, but you wouldn't pre-design a process or a set of questions, would you?
Yeah, I think you might. So sometimes, depending on if I know what the topic is going to be, I'll tend to have 3 or 4 really juicy questions in my back pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Just to get the group going, just to get them, excited about the topic. Sometimes I'll facilitate an activity before we get started. It might be sometimes it's a visualization, exercise. Sometimes it's more of a creative thing where I ask them to personify I did that recently, their confidence champion, and they have to find an image that represents their confidence champion. And then I use some of that in the coaching. It's like, oh, what would your confidence champion say to you? Things like that. So I think there's a little bit of prep in terms of activities, questions, but I think the bigger thing is you always have to be ready to let it go.
It always boils down to the same.
It's like you have it, you're ready. And I know, especially for newer coaches or newer group coaches, there's, being in the unknown is really, really hard. And as coaches, we get trained to be in the unknown with one other person, one-on-one. And we're usually pretty good at just going with the flow of where this person wants to go, trusting our intuition that we'll ask a question that will bring value to the person that we're coaching. I think with the group, I think you said that word earlier. Sometimes there's a little bit of a feeling that we should be performing, a little bit of like, oh, I'm in front of people, so I need to perform. And having prepped in advance, having a couple of activities in your back pocket, having a couple of questions, it helps a lot of people feel more confident that, okay, if complete silence happens, no one talks, and I feel like I don't know what to do, at least I can throw something at them. And I think that's important because if it means that it allows for someone to go in with a little bit more groundedness and confidence, then by all means, I would say have something ready. Just know that there's a high chance the group is going to go in a direction that you hadn't thought they would, and you might not be able to use those questions or activities.
Yeah. And I wonder to what extent, so how do you, I would be curious in a couple of things. How you prepare the group. As you said, you need to, if you want them to coach each other and to get into this mindset, how do you help them to get out of the let me tell you what to do mode? Or because I think it's so natural that, especially in a coaching context where we are more vulnerable and talking about our personal stories, I think it's something in our human brain that we create bonding by projecting our own story on someone else and then having the impression that, oh, I totally understand what you mean. Let me tell you what I did and it will work for you. And no, it doesn't. I think it's something no natural human.
Yeah.
How do you help them to get rid of that?
Yeah. I think that's one of the most important pieces that will make a coaching group successful, is that understanding. And so for me, there's always an education piece where I absolutely become a trainer, a teacher, a facilitator of learning, versus a coach at the beginning of an engagement. So usually before the engagement even begins, this can take several forms. It could be the whole cohort. Sometimes, I'll be part of a coaching cohort where 150 people are going to be in groups. So we'll do a whole orientation for all of them. Sometimes I have a program coming up where we have 6 groups of just 3 people. So it'll be 18 people. Same thing. We're doing an orientation. And so in that orientation, it's really about teaching them the skills that they need in order to be great coaches to each other. So in those moments, I take the skills completely out of context. So it's not about being a great effective communicator. It's about being a great coach, and we're teaching you how to be a great coach. And so we think about, so for the advice giving piece, for example, I'll ask them to think about two scenarios, right? So one might be, I need to have a hard conversation with one of my direct reports, and one of the questions might be, or one of the attitudes might be, well, I tell you what, you should definitely take a few breaths before you go into that conversation, and then tell them what you think immediately, because that will help you to feel more comfortable in that conversation. The second approach might be, wow, what do you think would be helpful for you to approach that conversation? And then I ask people to give me their feedback, and I go, how do you feel about these two scenarios, these two ways to approach this conversation with someone? And that comparison often brings up such rich conversation. So we'll talk about that. And then I'll talk about the fact that, hey, that once someone has an idea by themselves, it actually creates new neural pathways that create motivation. That means that they're probably most likely to take action. So imagine if you tell someone what to do, you're not giving them that opportunity. You're robbing them of that new connection that they might be able to make for themselves. And so it's really about helping them understand the reason why advice giving might not be the best way to go in a coaching conversation. And I always say it doesn't mean that advice is always a bad thing to do. There are moments where someone might want to hear different perspectives. My encouragement to you is, if that is what you want in that moment, then ask for it.
Back to the agency.
Exactly. It's like, what do you need in this moment? Do you want to hear 3 different people's advice so that it gives you perspective? Or do you want to think about what's most important to you in this moment? So that's one skill, or one thing that we talk about. The other piece is what makes a great question. And so we help them to understand what makes a great question. And often people go to why questions immediately. And so, yeah, right.
Dangerous.
And exactly. And so helping them see, the fact that the question, why are you scared? Versus the question, what will it take for you to take one step forward? What difference do you see in these two questions? And we invite conversation around the questions. And again, it's all about helping people see, okay, why questions are not always bad, but sometimes if someone is feeling, triggered or stressed, or they're not at their best emotionally, asking them a why question might feel judgmental, it might feel accusatory, and so it's really that preparation piece, the education piece. I can't stress how important it is enough. And with, I mentioned earlier, a lot of group coaching programs take place over several months. So there's time. It's not like we're doing a one-off, 4-hour session. We'll probably be seeing each other for the next 6 months. So it's important that we know how to be with each other, how to support each other.
Yeah. And would you then call behavior out if you're in this group context and then someone comes with their advice?
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so couple of ways. Most of the time I make a joke of it. And I'll say, hey, notice what you did there? Yeah, you were giving advice, or if someone comes up with sometimes people ask questions that this advice disguised as a question.
Have you thought of doing this? Question
So,
mark.
exactly. And so in those moments, I'll often make a joke. The other thing that I do is I'll ask people to think about, okay, let's practice not giving advice. Here's the situation. This person has to have a difficult conversation with the direct report. I want everybody in this room for a minute to think about a situation where you had to have a difficult conversation with the direct report or with someone, maybe with your best friend. Think about what helped you in that moment and then turn that into an open-ended question. For example, well, when I had to have a difficult conversation, I wrote everything down that I wanted to say so that it would help me to understand, to not miss anything out, and it would take it all out of my head. Question: what might you do to prepare, or what might you do to feel prepared? When I had to have a hard conversation, I asked a mentor for advice. Question: who might you ask for advice in this moment? So I
love that.
sometimes in a session will say, let's take a moment to help you reframe and understand how you might turn your own experience into a question so that this person can find what's right for them. And sometimes I will say, let's keep the last 10 minutes of this session just to share ideas, resources, advice. And that's the moment where let's do this. The other thing that I'll do, and then I'll stop talking,
No,
is
please don't.
sometimes I'll say, oh, I can catch it. They start saying like, oh, maybe you could, and I'll be like, oh, pause here, hold your thought, write it down, and keep it for until the end of this session. And at the end of the session, you can share your thought, you can share the advice, the piece of advice that you were going to give. So lots of different ways. I think the important piece is also not making, like, we don't want to become tyrants, right? Like, we can't do any advice, like, and so I think for me, it's humor is always a great way, and gently reminding, hey, remember, we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to think about this for themselves before we tell them what to do.
Yeah. Thank you. So rich. And what I hear, or what I want to underline, that when you say using humor, you always refer to something that you have said beforehand in order to frame the conversation. So you can use humor after you have already defined the rules of the game or set the boundaries or clarified some principles, and then say, remember, this is what we agreed upon, or you remember the paper you signed about our agreements?
Exactly.
But if you haven't clarified that in advance, it's very difficult to actually use humor to call it out.
100%. Yes, I could not agree more. And actually, you bring up something that I can't believe I didn't talk about before, but with coaching groups, the first session, we always spend time co-creating our agreements. How are we going to function together? And so being able to then call on those is also super, super helpful. Yeah.
In thinking of the best way to ask the sequence of questions, what is the optimal group size of a group coaching?
I love 6. I think 6 is an amazing number. 6 to 8, I would say, is really my sweet spot. It also depends on how long we have with the group. So my group coaching sessions tend to be 90 minutes, and 6 to 8, 90 minutes, wonderful. I have a group I mentioned I'm starting an engagement where we have 6 groups and there'll be 3 people in each group. So we're moving to just an hour for 3 people. I think the important piece is how do we make sure that in whatever time we have, there is enough time for everyone to have their voice in the room and to at least be asked a couple of questions and to potentially ask a couple of questions.
Mm.
And so if we have, 10 people in the room, it becomes much harder to get to deeper connection. And sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, I have a group coaching program. We have 20 people." And how can you do that? That's not. Then you're facilitating. You're not. Then you're not group coaching. You're facilitating a session. It's very different to me. And I think with larger groups, I say no. I don't want to coach larger groups because then I don't feel that I'm coaching. I'm happy to facilitate. Very different. But with groups, let's say it has happened that I've had 8 people and we only had an hour. So then what I would do is I offer breakouts and I'll have people, go and coach each other for, let's say, 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, come back, and then we debrief as a group and we ask more questions and go deeper as a group. I think that's an important piece actually, because often people think, oh, group coaching, it has to be that the whole group stays together all the time. But I personally believe that having breakouts, having moments where the group can be in smaller groups and connect a little deeper with just 1 or 2 people is actually pretty interesting and really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. This would have been my next question. And from what I hear is that so this is then a layer of facilitation skills, very helpful in group coaching without turning it into a facilitated session where you allow the group to go deeper, create more intimate spaces by breaking out. But it doesn't mean that you give them activities or it's overly process designed.
Exactly. I think, when we talk about, we talk about a lot about the difference between psychological safety and trust. And psychological safety is a group created construct, right? Versus trust is an individual construct. And so if we want psychological safety to happen, trust is really helpful, and trust is built between 2 individuals. And so if we have opportunities for everybody to go, in my very first sessions with any group, I try to create an opportunity for everyone to be in a breakout with everybody else at some point, just so that they're starting to build that trust, which helps us then build the group safety, because they, like you said, they have these intimate conversations. But you're right in that what I'll tend to do in those moments is, okay, everyone has a situation that they can relate to the topic we're talking about, that they'd like to be coaching on, that they'd like to be coached on. Let's go into the rooms. You have 5 minutes each to ask questions. And that's all you're going to do is ask questions. The other person's going to answer. We're really going to coach each other. And then we'll come back and see what insights have come up. So you're right. It's not like I'm not telling them to go and do an activity and like it's really just go and ask each other questions, coach each other.
Yeah. Beautiful. And thank you for the distinction between trust and psychological safety. I think there's a lot of confusion around the two. And what I find, just as a tangent, so interesting is that yes, trust between individuals can reinforce psychological safety, but if there's too much trust just within a small group, it can actually also harm the psychological safety because there's an imbalance. And it's so important then to see how to mitigate that or to create balance again.
Definitely. And I think that's something that we see more that we tend to see more in teams than in groups.
Yeah.
Because groups often, again, people are not connected. Most of the time, they're not connected outside of the group. And so they might connect once in a while, but there are no sort of pre-existing relationships. And so the time that they have together, that's why I'm very conscious of like everyone gets time with everyone else, so as not to favor any potential, cliques being built or being formed or so yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If there's too much trust between three people and there are inside jokes that are just between these three people and they're not like whole group, then that can definitely harm the safety of the group. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. And how do you, it's really interview style, but I'm fascinated.
Go for it.
What I'm really curious about is how do you handle certain situations that we encounter in both in a facilitated situation as much as in a coaching situation? And I'm thinking of different personality types. I guess that as much as you prime and educate them about curious questions, there's still those who speak more than others, those who might take too much space, which is very judgmental, who enjoy speaking more than others. And there might be even those who are actually mostly interested in solving their own issue and less interested in coaching others. Is there a way that you would screen participants for a group coaching beforehand and say, maybe this is not for you? And still someone might slip through. So how do you deal with that before and in the session?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think two things, right? One context is mostly in the personal realm, people will have an opportunity to curate their group and they can say, hey, maybe this isn't the best thing for you. Maybe one-on-one might be a better coaching environment for you. So I always highly encourage anyone who's building a group coaching program to have individual conversations with anyone who might be a participant, because we are responsible for the integrity of the group. And if we can, it's a very delicate thing, because to say, I don't think this person is going to be a great addition to the group is making big assumptions, and we just never know. So it's very, very delicate. I like to say, trust your gut. There are moments where you might feel like, oh, this might be a challenge for me. This person might be a challenge for me, but they will bring great value to the group. So challenge yourself. And there are moments, I'll give you an example. I recently, not too long ago, this wasn't a group coaching program. This was for our group coach training certification program. And I started to speak to this person, and they were like, "Oh yeah, no, I've done that before. Oh yeah, no, and I know this. I have a PhD, in organizational development, and yeah, no, I understand this." And I was just like, okay, why are you even talking to me? Why are you even interested? Because one of the things that we say to our participants is, we want the richness of your experience. We want your wisdom. The whole point is that we are here learning together and bringing our experiences together. Your generosity is welcome and important, but your superiority is not. And so this person, I was like, I don't think this is for you. I don't think you'd get much from this program. And I was like, okay, bye. So this person did not join the group. So this is the one thing. There are moments where we can curate the groups. There are others where we work in organizations. For myself as a group coach, there are groups that I curate. There are groups that in organizations I'm given. I don't have a choice as to who is in the group. So the important thing for me is do my homework. If I can I have one-on-one conversations with every participant. With every participant, sorry, if I'm not able to do that, then I'll ask them to fill out an onboarding form where I get to understand what it is that they want to be thinking about. But I also ask questions specifically about their experiences in groups. What's a group that you've been a part of that you really enjoyed? What did you enjoy about it? What's a group you've been a part of that you did not enjoy, that you don't want to replicate? So it helps me to get a sense of, well, what are, first of all, in terms of their group experience, what are the biases that they're bringing into this group? How are they coming into the group experience? Are they coming in with a previous experience of like, I had the best time, I learned so much? Or are they coming in from a point of view of like, well, the last time I was in a group, I was, made to feel, I don't know, terrible about myself, or I could never speak up because I wasn't given an opportunity to talk. So maybe they're coming in with that experience. So that helps me, and so that helps me understand. So I'm going at your question in a very long-winded way, but doing my homework is a really, really important piece of it. And then in terms of dealing with derailing behaviors when they happen, because they will happen always, I think the techniques are going to be very similar to the techniques that you might use in facilitation. If someone is taking up a lot of airtime, then I might sometimes I say this at the very beginning of a group. I'll say, at some point you might see me do this. And for those of you who are listening, I'm like turning my finger around, like wrap it up. And you might see me do this. It means that, we appreciate your contribution, and I'd love for you to bottom line what it is that you want to say. It's a great skill to have, and so I'm going to encourage you to use it. So I make a little joke of it. If they keep going, then I sometimes I'll say, let me pause you here. Let me pause you for a second. Group, what are we hearing from Miriam at the moment? She's shared a lot. What are you all taking away for yourself in what she just shared? And so I'll try to like bring it back to the whole group. Sometimes I'll say to them, thank you so much. I always thank people for their contribution. I think it's really important. So thank you so much for sharing all of this. You've said a lot, so I'd love for you to take a moment to notice what's most important for you in what you just shared. So take a few seconds, write it down, notice it, add it to the chat, and in the meantime, I'll go back to the group and say, okay, what else is coming up? And so I think I would imagine that the techniques are very much the same as techniques we might see in facilitation context.
Yes, and I'm very grateful for your examples and the script, and I can imagine that there's some people in the audience just pushing the pause button and writing it down, because I think it's extremely elegant. It's very elegant, and I will definitely copy that to thank the person and then ask the group, okay, we've been hearing a lot. What are you taking away? Because it acknowledges the person and their sharing. It gives them the sense of, oh, I have contributed already, so there is no need to speak further, and invites different voices in. Because I think what happens most internally of someone that we interrupt is that they feel dismissed, as if nothing of what they've shared has been important. And I think what happens in the audience is at some point they do stop listening, and they do get so annoyed that they forget about everything that has been shared and could be of value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give, in the little orientation that we do, I'll share the two acronyms that I love. Many people use the wait, why am I talking acronym, to help them think. If you find yourself talking a lot, then perhaps wait a minute. And then the other one is listen, if you switch the letters around for listen, it spells out silent. And so help yourself and be silent for a moment. If you're that, I challenge them, if you're that type of person who likes to talk a lot, then I invite you to come into this group with a different way of being and try it out. See what it's like to pause and listen more. That's really helpful. And then the other thing is, if I notice, we notice it very quickly if someone's a talker. If I notice that that's the case, sometimes I give parameters to the whole group and I'll say, okay, we're going to share our thoughts here. You're going to have 2 minutes. And as you know, I'm ruthless with time. So everybody's going to have 2 minutes. No matter where you are, I'm going to cut you off. So make sure that your 2 minutes counts. And what is it exactly that you want to say? So that's also been really helpful to help the talker kind of participate.
I love that. And still, I find it fascinating to balance that, because I do believe that there are different categories of people. Some of us speak to think and other think to speak. And I'm one of those speak to thinkers. And I think that's why I enjoy podcasting so much, because very often I speak out things and I'm like, oh, that was an interesting thought. But just sitting down, not speaking, the thought would have never occurred to me. So it's as if I need to use my vocal cords to activate my brain. And this can be very annoying for people who actually think to speak, because I need some, give me a moment to digest all of that and to hear my own thoughts. I need silence to hear my thoughts.
Yeah. I am very much like you. I like to process. I don't know what you asked me at the beginning, but I was like, oh, interesting. I just hadn't thought of it that way. So I absolutely am with you. I think so. For the think to speakers, I like to always make sure that there are moments in the conversation where I'll pause everyone and say, let's take a minute and see what's coming up for you. Write down your thoughts. And sometimes I'll say, draw your thoughts, write your thoughts, think your thoughts, whatever is helpful for you in this moment. You don't have to write. So just make sure I'm inclusive of everyone. I do think that for the speak to thinkers, love these terms, by the way, thank you for using those. I think that as facilitators, as coaches, experience kind of tells us when someone is speaking to think. And I think I'm quite good at noticing, okay, this person is processing here. And I will often let them process, versus this person's just talking because they love the sound of their own voice. You know what I mean? I think there is a difference, and I think that most of the time I can catch it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes.
Maybe I'm
and I
just
think there's
flattering
even a
myself.
third group that speaks and then almost gets scared of what they just said and then need to ramble over it afterwards. So and then suddenly they get into this infinite loop where they just repeat what they have said, but in different variations. And it's almost humorous to observe. And at some point it becomes annoying. So we have to.
Yes. And this is where a coaching mindset is awesome, because then we can coach around that, because we can help them to notice that in themselves. So if I see someone do that, most of the time I will jump in and I'll say, I'd love for you to take a moment to notice what you did here. You said something very pertinent that was really impactful, and then it seems like you felt the urge to justify it. What happened there for you? And that process of like, oh yeah, well, then that helps them notice, which can bring us, in group coaching, confidence is a topic that comes up all the time, and with emerging leaders, we have to think about how we show up, how we are perceived. And so being confident in and owning our ideas is really important. So that becomes part of the coaching around communication and confidence. So that maybe I might not do if I was in a workshop or training situation, but in a coaching group, we can take that opportunity.
And thank you for saying that, because I was about to make this reflection that for me, it's now the difference between a coaching context and a facilitation context is so clear with this example. In a facilitated session, I would never make such a reflection and put someone on the spot to invite them to first highlight what they've done and invite them in front of everyone to reflect upon it. And I think it has to do with the permission and so when we sign up for a group coaching program, we give permission to the coach to coach us, obviously, in front of everyone. And this is the purpose of being there together, to work on ourselves. And in a workshop, we haven't given that permission. So we are speaking about content and ideas. So a facilitator who dares then reflecting on someone's behavior, someone's process, I think is almost crossing boundaries and putting the psychological safety, the safe space, at risk.
Yeah, I totally agree. And even in a coaching group, I will always ask for permission to do that. Even if we've set permission from the beginning, in each session, you can never ask someone for permission too many times. So if I notice that behavior, and I didn't say it earlier, but I probably will start by saying, could I make an observation here on your process? And if the person says no or doesn't respond, I'll say, okay, no worries, let's keep going. Most of the time people say yes, because that's
why they're
for.
there.
Exactly. But you're absolutely right. And that for anyone who is listening and is creating those spaces, permission is hyper important, whether in a one-on-one coaching conversation or in a group conversation. In a group, it's heightened because we don't want to put people on the spot in front of everyone. But even in one-on-one conversations, sometimes we don't know where people are coming from when they come into our session. And maybe they had like a really shitty day. They're just like, it's 6 p.m. I'm exhausted. And right now, honestly, I don't want to think about my process. Like, that's fine. Yeah. That's okay. Yeah. Like, I get it. I totally get it. So permission is super important. Yeah.
Yeah. And even amongst friends, when I observe my friends doing certain things, I'm like, oh, may I share my observation?
Yep. Yep.
And then sometimes it's, oh yeah, sure. Sometimes it depends on the observation. And other times it's like, no, just shut up. Don't need any coaching right now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But permission, I thank you for bringing that up, because it's such an important concept.
What makes a group coaching fail? What brings the session to fail?
Being so ego, a coach. I've seen sessions where coaches are talking about themselves a lot, and that's not good. Right? So I think there's a fine line between sharing an experience that we've had as a human to invite vulnerability in the room, and making it, very pertinent, very quick, very relevant, versus this is the me show, and let me tell you all about how awesome I am. And I have seen that, and that does not go down well because, well, it's not about me, it's about the group. So I think that, I think a coach who, I think the extremes, right? So I said earlier when we first started talking that I tend to be pretty hands off. I'll take a step back and observe what's being said out, but that doesn't mean that I'm not present. So I think there's a coach who is too present, and there's a coach who's like just like, let them talk, and I think both extremes can not work. What I always say is, sometimes, so I said earlier, I'm a bit of a purist. In group coaching sessions, I think that the coaching piece is really, really important. It doesn't mean that a whole session has to be coaching. It could be that out of a 90-minute session, there's a 45-minute facilitation, more training piece, and 45 minutes of coaching. And that's great, right? So I think for a group coaching session to fail, it has to be that the participants did not get a chance to reflect on themselves or their processes or the obstacles that they're facing. That's what makes a group. To me, that's what a failed group coaching session is. But, I said earlier, some coaches, they'll go in and they'll coach everyone in front of the group. For some people, that will be a success for the participants, because they've been coached, they've heard other people, they can gather the insights, So I think that's what my answer is that it's a session where the group participants did not get an opportunity to reflect on themselves and ask questions and be asked questions.
And maybe where the content is not, where they don't take away anything that is tangible, applicable.
Yeah, I think sometimes, so with coaching, it's interesting because sometimes the insights that they'll have is more around awareness than action. Sometimes at the end of a session, they'll like the biggest takeaways, like, wow,
Blind spot.
I do this. Yeah, it's like, oh wow, I say something really good and then I spend 5 minutes trying to justify it. Like, that's my takeaway. And so sometimes we always try to end with actions and what are you going to, you have this insight, great, what are you going to do about it? But sometimes the takeaway is not a thing, right? It's just that individual realization.
And it's interesting because for me, in my understanding, application is a realization, is something that is tangible for myself. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have to act upon it or do something.
Yeah.
It's something that is a self-reflection where like, oh,
yeah,
see
exactly.
something. It's practical. It's not theoretical. I think that's what I meant.
Yeah, 100% agreed. Yeah.
And knowing just a little bit more about ourselves.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, coaching, everything is about self-awareness, right? Everything that we're doing through the coaching piece is deepening our understanding of ourselves. And if we can do that, if we can hold the mirror to ourselves, then we can create alignment with others. We can create accountability with others. But if we can see ourselves, then we can't do anything.
Yeah, and still it's the most difficult, right? Yeah, I think it's a journey that never stops.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah, it also keeps it interesting. That's true. And sometimes frustrating. And
yes. Sometimes there's the learning journey when you think of like unconscious incompetence, and so it starts at unconscious incompetence, it moves into conscious incompetence, and when we're in that moment of unconscious incompetence, it's like we don't know what we don't know, and ignorance can be bliss sometimes.
Oh yes, and I find it fascinating those who start their coaching journey or their facilitation journey, suddenly they see it everywhere.
Yes.
And then, including myself, when I learn something new, then I see it everywhere and I have the impression, how can all these people not see it?
Yep.
So evident. And then we
Totally.
start coaching everyone who doesn't want to be coached.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then the next important step is to have the conscious incompetence.
Exactly. And that's the worst. Yeah. That's the worst.
Yeah.
And that's what coaching is. That's exactly what it is helping ourselves. And I include myself in it because obviously I'm being coached and all the things, but I think that's what coaching is. And whether it's one-on-one or groups, that's what it's all about, is like, let's become more aware of what we didn't know, and then let's work through all the messiness together so that we can get to conscious competence and unconscious competence, that and eventually hopefully mastery. But I think that's part of that's what coaching is.
Yeah.
See something new and work on it.
Yeah. And you just mentioned that you're coached yourself, and I think so. I also have a coach, and I obviously am part of a facilitation community because I'm building one. But I wonder, where do you train, or how do you learn and keep in the practice? Is it also through group coaching? Are there also communities, or is it being coached?
Yeah, a little bit of everything, honestly. So Group Coaching HQ is a community of coaches, and so I'm always learning from our trainees. I mentioned earlier, everybody brings such rich experience. So anyone who trains with us, I learn from them. I am a contractor for a few companies, and a lot of them, they have coach communities for the other contractors. So we get together and, oh, what do you do if this happens? Or, how do you deal with XYZ? Or so coaching supervision is really, really important to me, and being in community with other coaches who are learning. And then I take at least one training every year. That is something that I'm excited about doing. So at the moment, for example, I'm doing a team coaching training. I've done team coaching before, but it's really cool to take an official training, and it's opening me up to ideas that I hadn't had. And because I tend to coach mostly groups, there are differences that I'm not as aware of, or that. So I'm learning a ton. So for me, it's those three things. I think like my own company and training and community, being part of other coach communities where we do supervision and share ideas, resources, etc. And then actual trainings. I think we never stop learning, right? I mean, if we do, it's very sad.
So true. And then, so everything you say, I have new questions popping up. I feel like a mushroom garden, because I'm thinking of the level of vulnerability. So, for instance, when we're both building a community of peers, and still we are in a position where we are the founders or the leaders or whatsoever. So, and in facilitation, yes, we do get a little bit vulnerable, but it doesn't get to the absolute core of it. So yes, I'm very comfortable. I love being in workshops with my community, and I take at least time for 1 or 2 workshops per week to be there as a participant because I continue learning. And as you were sharing, I was wondering, would I sit in a group coaching as a participant with my community? I love them to death, but hell no.
So part of our program, right, our training certification program is that the group of coaches who are together for 12 weeks coach each other. Every single week they're together in coaching sessions, and the instructors observe, give feedback. About 3 weeks ago, one person couldn't make it. We had a smaller group. One participant couldn't make it, which meant that the person who was coaching would only have two people to coach. And I wanted her to have at least three. So I said, you know what? I'm going to jump in and I'll be one of the participants. And I loved it.
Oh, wow.
It was so great. It was so great. And you know, talk about creating a bond. I felt so, I loved it. I loved it. And I think there are two things that come at play. One, I personally, I always feel that I'm an open book. I don't mind sharing my thoughts with my deepest thoughts with people. That's who I am. I'm very open. I don't mind. And two, with coaching, whether it's group or one-on-one, confidentiality is always such an important piece. And so I know that being in that session, we have, you know, let's say 30 minutes of coaching. I know that those 30 minutes are going to stay within this group, and at the end of it, I'm not gonna feel like, oh my God, who's gonna know about what I just said? Or so I think establishing confidentiality is really, really important. And I think coaches have to, and I say have to, I'm choosing to say have to be able to be coached in front of other coaches. That's part of the deal. Otherwise,
Yeah,
if you're not able to be vulnerable, something missing.
thank you for sharing that. A few things came up for me. One is coming back to what you shared earlier. The coaching context is you're there over several. It's not like it's a big group. It's not the group of 20 where you're then in the hot seat being coached. And every week it's a different group, as we have it in the facilitation. So yeah, now I understand it. It's a different context, a different degree of confidentiality and consistency.
Yeah.
And yes, I totally agree. You have to be willing to be coached in front of others as a coach, also to know how it feels for your group participants. And still, and I don't know, I have to sit with that, where I think the difference is when you're suddenly in the role of the builder of the community, the kind of person who holds it all together, who holds space for everyone, and then suddenly going into this very, very vulnerable state. Somehow there's, for me, still a difference, and maybe I'm just making that up. So I will reflect upon that.
I'm trying to think of it. You know, I when I was head of coaching for a company that I helped build, we ran at the very beginning. I remember we called it a coaching mastermind for some of our coaches, and it was 8 of us, and for 8 weeks, one person would coach and the others would give feedback. It was kind of a, you know, let's do this together, let's learn together. And so, and I was their boss. I mean, I was the head of coaching, and so I had to be, but I had to be their boss, but also I had to be vulnerable, and I had to be just as open as everyone else, because if I was going to be a participant in that context, I can't go in halfway and not, you know, and not show up fully. So I don't know. I'm trying to think. I think and I was building that community at the time, and so I think there was a element of trust for me that we all understand the parameters of what's happening here. And here I am a peer, we're learning together, we're growing together. And then when I step out of this, I am the head of coaching.
Mm.
I think the second thing, and I'll be quick, I know we're running out of time, but I think the other thing, now that I'm thinking about it, speak to think, now that I'm thinking about it, is that the coaching community is very different from any other communities. And I think the people who come into coaching, there's that understanding of where confidentiality stops. Like it is, yeah. I think it's a given, at least with the coaches that I'm in connection with.
Yeah, this makes sense. And I guess it's less heterogeneous in terms, there's so many different facilitators.
Right.
A facilitator is not a facilitator. Even this would then be a debate and open another Pandora's box. But I think that's true that the concept of a coach and the parameters and the guiding principles of a coach and much more aligned or homogeneous.
Yeah.
What remains your number one facilitation challenge?
I think it's when I go into an organization specifically, and the participants think that it's a facilitated training that they're coming into, and they're very quickly challenged when they realize that it's a group coaching conversation. And the differences between the two. So when the education piece has not happened before a group begins, that makes it very, very hard. And so for me, it goes back to how do I make sure that I go in with my education hat on, my understanding hat on, of like, hey, this is not an easy thing to do, to jump into coaching. So I kind of have to adjust and perhaps be a little more structured than I would like to be. And then I make sure that there's connection. I like to gamify things sometimes, but I think that for me is a really big one, is when the homework or when the pre-work has not been done, and then within a session, I don't really want to go into it too much now because of timing, but I think there are moments where insensitive comments might be made, or there might be a microaggression, an everyday comment that is made, and I need to deal with it because the person who received the comment might not want to speak up, or and so I have to step in. So those moments can be extremely challenging.
Thank you for sharing that. And then I wonder, and that's an assumption that sometimes we perceive or we hear microaggression that might even not be there, and then also balancing, okay, are you taking away ownership and agency from that person who's receiving it?
We have to, exactly. That's where the challenge is. I think it's like in that moment, noticing and making the judgment call of like, what do I want to. So the way that often I would deal with it, a dear friend of mine facilitates workshops around psychological safety, and one of the tips that she always gives, and that I have taken to heart, is to ask the person, did I just, this is what I heard you say. Could you clarify what you meant by that? Or could you, and so it's not attacking anyone. It's not putting that person on the spot. But so there are ways to deal with it, but I still find it really challenging.
Yeah. Thank you. Which juicy conversation. Thank you so much, Dom.
Loved it.
Yeah,
you so much, Mariam. I
I
feel
could
like
have
we
just
could
continued.
I know, I know, I know. I need to visit Amsterdam so we can actually sit and have a coffee and
Yes,
keep the
please.
conversation going.
Because I cannot imagine, this was actually already the second half of our conversation because we had it the other way around on your channel. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much for your generous sharing.
No, thank you so much for having me and for asking these wonderful questions and helping me think and make realizations on the spot. I loved it. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. And I'll put all the links on how to reach you in the show notes so that people
Amazing.
can check out your community and learn from you, continue learning from you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Miriam. And I'll talk to you soon.
See you soon. Bye.
All right. Bye.